Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and in this video I want to talk about how I got into Linux and how you can too. Um, I got into Linux back when I was in high school, and I know that's not necessarily the norm for many of the people in this industry. A lot of people have been Windows developers or Mac developers for a long time, and now with the popularity of things like Docker and serverless, um, and some other thing, .NET Core is now like, lots of people are using it. It's a real viable deployment target. A lot of people are getting kind of thrust into Linux with absolutely no background, and I want to put together a few resources to kind of help ease the transition. So a while back, I think it was last week or the week before, I did a video on the essential Linux that you need to know as a software engineer. I'll leave a link to that in the video description. But in this video, I want to kind of go through my path through learning Linux in the hopes that it might help some of you, and to help you kind of get a firmer grasp on Linux in its full capacities, and not just from a, oh, I use it for this specific task, during my daily workflow. So this is going to be more geared toward, desktop Linux, because I did run Linux on the desktop, or a desktop, for a while, and we'll see that as we get into it. So like I said, I started on Linux when I was in high school. I did have a Windows machine. Windows was kind of the de facto there. Mac OS was still kind of starting its recovery from the pre-Steve, or the between Steve Jobs eras. 1997 is when he came back to Apple, and when OS 10 started to take off, and they really started to kind of get their feet back under them again. So I didn't get into Mac OS until 2008. So our story starts before then. So when I was in high school, I was part of what was called the online staff. Basically, it was a student organization that was responsible for maintaining the high school's website. The website ran on an SGI IRIX machine. SGI has been bought, and IRIX doesn't exist anymore. So this was a flavor of Unix, and it was actually kind of a pretty blue machine, but it was fairly old. And in the summer one year, between school years, it died, and the technology director of the school decided to stand up a new machine. He had plenty of old hardware. Every so often they would refresh their Windows machines. So he just grabbed a machine that had been recently taken out of service, installed Linux on it, and that became our new web server. So the flavor of Linux that he used was something called Mandrake. Now since then, Mandrake, they're actually no longer in business, but they combined with another company and renamed themselves Mandriva. I'm not sure how it was supposed to be pronounced, but back then it was still called Mandrake. And by the time I stopped using it, that was well before they changed their name. So the entire time I was using it, it was Mandrake Linux. And because they were using it for the machine that ran the school website, I used that distribution, or that flavor of Linux, when I started my first investigations into running Linux. So at home, I had a desktop machine that was kind of my current machine. It was a custom build running Windows, but it was actually the second iteration of my custom built machine. So I had a bunch of other parts from the first build that were still good parts. They were just older. So of course I did what any self-respecting computer nerd at the time would do, and I bought the other parts, the parts that I hadn't gotten replacing, got a case, that sort of thing, and put all of these old parts into a new machine and installed Linux on it. And of course I chose Mandrake. So that was my introduction into Linux, and I used that on the desktop. I think I had a KVM switch because I only had one monitor and keyboard, so I could switch between the two machines as I needed to. So I did have a GUI on this Linux machine. And that was also my introduction into networking. I knew absolutely nothing about computer networking. And so I created this little local network, static IPs. It wasn't actually connected to the internet at the time. Yes, I was, deprived as a child. Eventually, I did connect it to the internet and learned the next batch of networking and how that would work. DHCP and that sort of thing. But after that, I wanted to kind of go to the next level, and Mandrake was. I'm not even sure how this guy found it. It certainly wasn't one of the popular ones. The popular ones at the time were Red Hat and Debian, and there were a couple clones. I think the Fedora project was just getting off the ground at that time. So I tried Fedora and I tried Debian. Eventually I settled on Debian, and I'm not exactly sure at what time it was that I settled on Debian. But I did eventually settle on Debian, and I think I tried Fedora first and then went to Debian. I don't know, Debian just feels more natural to me, and the Red Hat varieties of Linux just, I don't know, they rub me the wrong way for some reason. No idea. This was a long time ago. So I've been using Debian for quite a while. Debian and its derivatives for quite a while. Then I went off to college, and I actually got a job as a system administrator in the computer science department. And being in the computer science department, it wasn't just run a bunch of Windows machines. They had a Sun Solaris network that I actually really enjoyed working with. Solaris is one of the things that's one of the high points of my career. Even though it was so early on, working with Solaris was absolutely fantastic. Solaris is not Linux. Solaris is a Unix variant, and I could go on for a long time about Solaris, so let's leave that to another video. So anyway, Linux-wise, there were plenty of different distributions that were in use there. CentOS, the kind of the free community-supported version of Red Hat, which is now part of Red Hat, which is now part of IBM. So CentOS, I used CentOS, and then Ubuntu was kind of starting to gain some traction, so I tried out Ubuntu. Still used Debian a bunch. And I also got into Gentoo because I was really interested in how the operating systems were put together, how all the pieces work together, how the different services communicated with each other, how the desktop environment could be considered a service and not part of the core operating system the way it is in Windows. So things that I really got into, that I was really interested in, that you might not be. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend diving into Gentoo as your next Linux distribution, unless you want to spend literally days just going from zero to a workable operating system that you can actually use. If you want to go closer to that direction, something like Arch might be more your speed. But again, something for a future video. After I left college, I moved out to Colorado, and I still had exposure to various Linux distributions from the various jobs that I was working. Some of them used Linux, some of them did not. But the ones that did, they were mostly using CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, those sorts of things. When I started my own companies, my familiarity was with Debian, but at the time I was running things that were fairly new. PHP was starting to gain a more momentum, so I wanted to be able to run the latest and greatest PHP, and Debian didn't always have that. So I actually switched to Ubuntu for my virtual private servers. So I use a company called Linode. They've grown a lot in the last several years. They're a fantastic company. Very simple offering. It's just a Linux server in the cloud. It's a virtual server, so it's a VM in the cloud. You get command line access, you get root access, you can do whatever you want on it. And I chose to use Ubuntu. I think you can also choose to use Debian and maybe a couple other flavors of Linux if you want to, but I chose to use Ubuntu rather. When I use EC2 instances in AWS, I also use Ubuntu, again, for the same reasons. There's no downside to using Debian on those sorts of things these days for my purposes, because I'm not using the latest and greatest anymore. And if I need to, I can always install like Docker or something like that. But I do run Debian on my personal server here in the house. And the main reason for that is because I wasn't as familiar with Ubuntu, and Ubuntu hadn't had it wasn't as mature as it is now back when I started running that server. That server has been in its current form with a few minor upgrades here and there. I think an upgraded disk array, an upgraded motherboard and CPU. It's also a custom build. It's the last custom build I did, and probably the last custom build I will ever do. But back when I first built it 15 years ago, I ran Debian on it, and I've just been upgrading it ever since. Debian to Debian, cleaning it up here and there, but it's always been Debian. I don't plan on changing that. I want it to be rock solid, stable. It's my file server, so I don't want it to be running anything that might kernel panic just because the latest and greatest isn't quite there yet. So that's kind of my story into Linux. That's how I got into it. So now, how can you get into Linux? Well, let's switch over to my desktop screen and do a quick demo. Okay, so here you'll see the virtualbox.org site, and this is my recommendation for how you can get into Linux. VirtualBox either didn't exist or I just didn't know about it when I first got into Linux, and I also had spare hardware lying around, so I just used my spare hardware. But if you don't have spare hardware lying around, and honestly, even if you have old hardware, I'd recommend using something a little bit newer just so you can get the full experience from Linux, especially if you're going the desktop route, because there are a lot of nice UI effects that just don't work as well on older hardware. And if you're just getting into Linux, I don't want you to incorrectly get the impression that Linux is slow or clunky or anything like that. Linux is actually blazing fast. There are definitely some things that can slow it down, but Linux by itself is fantastic. I've actually gotten a stripped down version of Ubuntu to boot on fairly decent hardware, still commodity hardware, but decent hardware in 8 seconds. You can't get that from Windows. You can't get that, well, you might be able to get that from Mac OS now, but that is from cold boot, completely off to fully booted up in 8 seconds. And that's with Linux. I did make some tweaks, but anyway, VirtualBox or another virtualization technology is definitely the route that I would go. If you have VMware Workstation, VMware Fusion for Mac, those work just as well. VirtualBox is free, it's open source. I have to be careful about saying open source. It is owned by Oracle, so I don't remember what the licensing on it is now. It is free. You can download it, you can use it, no constraints, and you can install whatever Linux you want in a VirtualBox VM and play around with it. You get a full GUI, you get the command line if you want that, you get the full experience, and it runs on whatever hardware you're using. So you can run it on Windows, you can run it on Mac, and that's actually what I'll be using in some future videos to show off some Linux distributions. I'll actually go back and show probably not the versions that I was using when I got into Linux, but the current versions of those Linux distributions, just to see how they've changed since I first started using them. So I would go ahead and download VirtualBox, and then I'd go ahead and download Ubuntu. Now I'm sure there are going to be people who comment, why would you recommend Ubuntu? You should recommend Insert distribution here. The reason I'm recommending Ubuntu is because it's super popular. There are tons of community answers. There's a thriving community. There's Stack Overflow posts, server fault and various sysadmin forums have tons of answers of how do you do X in Ubuntu with answers that actually work. And its graphical environment is not terrible. It doesn't look like Windows. It doesn't look quite like Mac OS. It does look different. It will take a little bit of getting used to, but it is a decent graphical environment. So that's why I recommend Ubuntu. It's super popular, super community supported, and you know, not terrible to get into. Some of the other distributions might take a little bit more of a learning curve, but if you just want to get into Linux and get a feel for, you know, how it works and what this whole LibreOffice thing is and things like that, Ubuntu is a good starting point. So grab a copy of Ubuntu. You can just let's see, how do you do it? Download and download Ubuntu Desktop. This is the LTS version if you want something that's probably stable and is going to be supported for a while. If it's in a VM, it's not the end of the world if you need to blow it away and rebuild it from scratch. Obviously, you'll lose all your data in the VM, but there's really no downside to getting the latest and greatest, even if it's not quite as stable. So 20.10, that was released in October of 2020, so just a couple months ago at time of recording. So go ahead and grab that one, is my recommendation. Download it, install it, run it in Virtualbox. You know, now that I say that, I think I may have had some issues installing this one in Virtualbox. So go ahead and grab the LTS version. New recommendation. Go ahead and grab the LTS version. I think this is the one I'm actually using in my Virtualbox and what I used for the video on Essential Linux for Software Engineers. So go ahead and download that, and you can fire up VirtualBox, attach the ISO, it's a .iso file that gets downloaded, attach that to the optical drive, the virtualized optical drive, boot up the machine, install it, and then you're off to the races. And I will do a quick video sometime in the near future on how to install Linux ISO in VirtualBox. If you don't want to wait, go ahead and search YouTube. I'm sure there are plenty of videos on how to install blah in VirtualBox. So go check those out. And that's how I would recommend getting started in Linux. Just install Linux, poke around. If you're doing some development like .NET Core, PHP, Ruby, Go, you know, any language that is, at this point, I don't think there are any languages, or there are very few languages that aren't cross-platform that you can't do on Linux. So whatever development you're doing, as long as it's not Windows desktop development, because obviously that has a dependency on the Windows desktop, or the equivalent on Mac OS. But if you're doing any sort of web programming, try it out on Linux. See how it goes. You can get Visual Studio Code on Linux. So if you want to do that, if that's your editor of choice, you can get that on Linux. Many of the other popular editors also work on Linux. Atom, well, that's the only one I can think of. And then you can start getting into things like Emacs and VI and that sort of thing, and get a little more Linuxy with your editor. My preference is for VI, well, technically Vim, over Emacs. I think I've described that in another video, but there's a definite learning curve there. And if you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, or you just want to use an editor that works on Linux, Visual Studio Code is a great choice and works fantastically on Linux. I've used it on Linux and never had an issue with it. So I think I should end the video there because it's starting to get a little long. But if you liked this video, please go ahead and subscribe and like and share. And sorry, I paused because I thought I messed up the screen capture, but I think we're okay. Hopefully you saw all of the demo stuff previously, but I'll leave links into the description to some other videos I have on this, and stay tuned and subscribe for the next episodes in this kind of mini series on as I look back at some of the Linux distributions that I've used in my past and see how they've progressed since I used them, 10, 15 years ago. Thanks for watching and have a great day.